Mr. Pravin Santhanam, thanks for being on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me again.
Of course. Last time we sat down, you were 21. You were 3 weeks out from moving to Kansas City to work at the Kansas City Royals. In that recording, you also said that your goal was to become the GM of a major sports team.
Yeah.
From going to the Kansas City Royals to where you're at today, I want to start the conversation there, just to give a little bit of a background of like who you are. Obviously, we speak like really frequently, but I want to give a little background of who you are, kind of what you do. This isn't Lenny's podcast, but we will be talking a little bit about AI, and I'm excited because there's so much that I want to ask you that I think will be really beneficial for people out there.
Yeah. So I guess I always sports has been a big part of my life forever. You know, my brother used to play baseball, basketball at a really competitive level. So I just kind of followed him. I have an older brother. And so, sports was always gonna be a part of my life. I think towards the end of my senior year of or like junior senior year of high school is when kind of the Moneyball stuff started becoming big. Moneyball is a book and then it became a movie, but the concept is how do you use like statistical analysis, data science, what's now like machine learning and AI to contribute to analyzing players to assist in all aspects of baseball operations. So that's, drafting players, trading for players, developing players. That's a big part of it that people don't really recognize is how do you, once you get a guy in the system, how do you actually help them improve and get better? Different things like that. In-game strategy, right? If you want to attack a certain player a certain way, how do you actually think about that? And so I was working on some like data science work, simulation work in high school. And that's kind of when I realized that, okay, like I kind of have an affinity for math, this type of process. When we went through school, both of us have an applied math degree. I took a bunch of computer science courses and I started developing kind of more of an affinity for being able to solve problems and, real business problems by converting them to, technical requirements. And then it kind of became towards the end of the senior year of or junior senior year of college where it was like, all right, what am I going to do now? I had the opportunity to graduate a semester early, but obviously I didn't want to do that because honestly, senior year, second half, nobody really does anything. So it was kind of like I didn't want to do that, but at the same time, like I didn't have a job lined up. So the decision was I'm going to apply to grad school as a backup, and then hopefully one of these sports jobs I was applying to at the time was going to fall through. And so, yeah, it ended up being like I randomly just applied to a position with the Royals. There's a website if you're interested in sports jobs called teamworkonline.com. And so, yeah, I just pretty much applied online it was a senior position. They were expecting people with a PhD or master's degree. And pretty much I went through the normal like data science process. So you do like an interview screen, then you do like a little take home project. So they had given me like anonymized data from a bat sensor. It's called blast sensor. They put it on the bat and you get data about, swing mechanics about that individual swing. And so they pretty much said like, hey, here's a bunch of de-identified data, meaning I didn't know what player was associated with what swing. Um, Go do something cool with it and present. That was in R. And so I kind of like figured that out on the fly. And then pretty much they told me like, look, like we can't give you this senior position, but the project you did was like on par with the other people that applied. So we're gonna make it a junior position and we'll give you the job. So then senior year, I flew out to Surprise, Arizona, which is where Kansas City has their spring training. And yeah, met with everybody and then kind of had a job from there. So yeah, 1 week after we graduated, I moved to Kansas City and I lived there for almost 4 years. And yeah, I mean, I talk about this a lot. Like that job has given me everything since in a lot of different ways. One of them is just like, I don't know if I call it coolness factor, but like kind of when you tell people you work in baseball, particularly you work in like not the ticketing part of it, but the actual like baseball operations, like helping the team win. I think people get, it's a kind of a dream job for a lot of people. It was for me. Like you mentioned, I wanted to be a GM and I kind of underestimated the road that was going to take and like how much years of dedication you have to be in. The other part of it is like I was one of the few people in the front office that had never played at eye level, right? Even, most of the women played, at least D2, D3 softball. And then like pretty much everybody in the front office was like a former player or, have been scouting or been in the game for a long time, right? So like their skill is baseball, which is like versus these type of Moneyball type roles, your skill is like kind of the mathematical machine learning part of it, and you have to learn the domain, right? And I think that's probably the biggest lesson I learned from baseball is you're only as effective in these type of jobs if you can explain the problems and kind of communicate effectively with non-technical stakeholders, right? So like a coach, right? If I'm trying to advocate for a player, and or let's take the GM, right? If I'm trying to advocate for a player, and I'm like, oh, yo, I really think we should sign this guy, or I really think we should promote this guy from the minor leagues to the pros, or I think we should do whatever, get rid of this guy, right? Saying answers like the model said so, or like the LLM told me now, right? Is like that's not an option, right? You
Hmm.
have to be able to distill and understand the way these models, which inherently are mathematical in nature, kind of how they perform, really do robust evaluation on how they work, and then be able to communicate that information to coaches that don't speak that language, right? But you have to be able to get them to understand, and there's like a translation you have to do between the technical aspects of it, and I got to explain it in baseball terms, right? And the same thing has to happen the other way, right? They have a problem that they need to be able to solve. Like examples, like how do you actually evaluate catcher defense, right? It's a complicated thing, right? A lot of aspects to it. There's framing, there's blocking, there's throwing guys out when they try to steal, right? There's all these different things, right? And so you have to be able to understand these problems at a really domain level, like high domain expertise level, to be able to convert them. So I think that kind of baseball gave me like a lot of technical skills. Like that's where I learned how to code. Like all the coding work I've ever done came from that. It gave me a lot of access to actually building machine learning models in production. I think the unique thing about that job also is that as young as we were kind of when we graduated, not too many people get to build stuff that actually you see the impact immediately, right? A lot of people, you work at Deloitte, you look at one of these like larger companies, right? You're probably doing cool work, but like a lot of times it becomes shelfware, stuff that you don't really see the impact, especially large companies. Whereas here it's like we built something and then like they were using it to call games the next day, right? Or coaches were using it to make decisions the next day, right? And so I think that that was a really unique pressure, obviously, especially when in a sport where if you don't perform or the team doesn't do well, like people get fired, right? Which is not always the case in other jobs. But at the same time, like you have a lot of autonomy and you make a really large impact. So I would say like, baseball gave me everything. The skill set I developed there because of the environment probably accelerated kind of where I was in my career, even though I was only like 3 or 4 years in. And then kind of that trampoline me into kind of bigger and better jobs. And I think that that has allowed kind of my, at least salary wise, definitely, but also skill, like responsibility wise, it kind of helped my trajectory kind of go a lot more exponential.
One thing that I think is worth pointing out there, like AI now, I think is a rebrand of machine learning, and most people don't realize that. And I think machine learning is very based on, well, not think I, know that machine learning is heavily based on math. And I don't want to do a like full deep dive, but transitioning like everything that you did for the Royals and kind of how you applied math there. I want to get your perspective as a data scientist on how math consistently shows up and the impact that it has on machine learning. I know that linear algebra is a predominant kind of use case for machine learning, and I think most people don't realize that all of these models that are being used, that most of it in the background, from my understanding, is just linear algebra and like graphs from all the conversations that we've had. So I'd love for you to like at a high level kind of break down how everything that you learned from school from a math perspective was used and kind of leveraged for everything that you did as an analyst or a data scientist at the Royals, and then kind of how you use that skill set coupled with code to kind of make your next transition in your career.
Yeah, so I think this is an important point, especially for people that are not too versed in this area, is especially with Gen AI, right? Gen AI. So I guess you made the point of like, what is the difference in AI and machine learning? Honestly, I don't know. To me, it's the same thing. I just think that the term AI is almost solely nowadays associated with Gen AI, which is large language models, right? Which is Claude, Gemini, Codex, all that type of stuff, ChatGPT. But that is a subset, right? Like there's a lot of other types of models that are not just foundational large language models, right? And so that's an important thing to kind of recognize. And the major thing to answer your question though is like none of this stuff is magic, right? It has a very clear um it has a very clear objective the way you define it, and it's some things are more explainable than others, and this is where model types differ. But all this stuff at the end of the day, under the hood, all of it is you're optimizing towards something, right? And so linear algebra and calculus are like the foundations for, and like probability theory are like kind of the three like foundations I would say of how almost every model works, right? But the idea is simply how do you distill a problem into a mathematical, what's called an objective function that you can then optimize, right? So if you can turn a problem into I want to minimize for something or I want to maximize for something, right? In a formula, right? I want to minimize the error between this and this, or I want to maximize, how close these two things are in the embedding space or whatever it is. Once you convert something to a mathematical formula you want to minimize or maximize, you then pretty much these algorithms that have been built around stochastic gradient descent, which is just like using calculus and derivatives to find the optimal part, right? So if you remember from calculus, right, if you have like a U shape, an up down U shape, right, the gradient or the derivative towards the top of the U, right, where it becomes flat for a brief second, right, that derivative is it approaches zero, right? And so when you can use the fact that derivatives that approach zero in certain cases are minimums and maximums to be able to identify, like optimize and move different weights of different things towards the minimum and maximum. So you're maximizing that objective function, right? And by doing that, that solves the problem, right? So like it's like steps, right? Converting the problem to a mathematical formula using all these algorithms that have been built over time and people are continuing to build on to use calculus in these complicated ways to maximize or minimize that objective function, and then that gives you the answer, right? So what happens though is that this is where data quality and certain aspects become really important, because there's certain aspects where if you define a problem in a certain way, optimizing for an objective function can give you, the model will cheat. So here's an example, right? There's something called class imbalance, which is if you're training a binary classification model or any type of classification model. Classification is I give you a bunch of inputs. I want to predict a class like cancer or no cancer, or he's going to make this play in the outfield or he's not going to make this play. Versus the output is a number. Like I'm trying to predict 5.3, right? That's called a regression problem. Classification is you're trying to predict like a class, right? So if you take cancer for example, right? A common problem that people are trying to use now in computer vision. Computer vision is like models that analyze images in video. Is I give you a scan of like a tumor or like an MRI or something. And I want to predict like based off the features in the image, does this person have cancer or not? Right? Most people, God willing, don't have cancer in these situations, right? Because cancer is a rare thing, right? There's some bias where if you get an MRI and people think you might have cancer, that obviously that makes it higher than the average population. But the point is, if for every 100 people, 3 people don't have cancer, right? Sorry, 3 people have cancer, and you try to build a model to predict based off the image if the person has cancer or not, 97 out of 100 people do not have cancer. So if you define the model where you're trying to optimize like accuracy, like just like whether or not you properly predicted it or not, the model will cheat and be like, oh, the easiest way to learn this pattern to get the highest accuracy is just by saying nobody has cancer, right? Because then I'm right 97% of the time, right? Because only 3 people have cancer. So instead of trying to learn like the nuances between, oh, this person has cancer because, the mass, this kind of looks like a mass and this other thing kind of looks like this other thing. And that's hard, right? You have to learn all these different like features, what's called features of kind of the image. The model would just cheat because the optimization function was built in a way, and there's a class imbalance problem where it would just say nobody has cancer, right? So this is an example of where like the math optimizes towards just saying nobody has cancer, right? And so things like this I think are important to understand. This is why like I think that AI tools are helpful for kind of writing code and doing implementation, but having fundamental understanding of how these things work are really important, because you can define your own objective functions in creative ways that allow you to squeeze out like really nuanced high performance models for your specific tasks. So I think that kind of calculus and linear algebra are the main kind of underpinnings of this, and the difficulty is how do you translate those problems into technical requirements in this objective function that you can use these kind of calculus algorithms to optimize for, but it underpins everything.
Yeah, and I think that the thing that's really important to call out there, I was actually listening to Scott Galloway on Dirivsia recently, and he was saying like AI and chat, like Gen AI chat interfaces, are like now kind of creating this environment where technology is almost a god to people. And it was weird at first. I was like really taken aback. I was like, that sounds very odd. But then the way he put it was like when someone prays, they like send their hopes kind of up into whatever
Yeah.
omniscient kind of being there is, and they hope that they're going to get an answer back and it's going to solve their problems, right?
Mhm.
Similarly, I think people are kind of falling into this with these Gen AI tools where, because they are providing such confident, well orchestrated answers, there is this assumption that the answer is correct. And, for anyone, I think that has more of a depthful understanding of machine learning and kind of everything that you just spoke to, and like how these outputs are provided, you have a better idea that these are, quite honestly, best estimated guesses, getting to your point, like an objective kind of answer that is just based on the kind of guardrails that it was provided. Um, so I was asking originally, so kind of as you implemented these models for the Royals, it was kind of more geared towards a very specific problem set. So solving for, you worked on an injury prevention model, you worked on, like you're saying, providing opinions and kind of educated decision making to the GM. But then you decided to kind of move away from the Royals and pursue something outside of sports. So I wanted to talk to kind of the difference of you moving from a sports environment to a more traditional data science environment and what that transition looked like for you.
Yeah, so it was a big culture shock for me. So obviously, like we just talked about, like the Royals job was the first job I had out of school. So that, I mean, that's my only real like big boy like corporate job, right? Before that, we were just like working as cashiers and stuff like that, whatever you do in college, right? So it was extremely small group, right? It was our department at the time was the like 6 people, 8 people, 8 people if you include everybody. Probably in terms of just like kind of lower level analyst, like it was just me and Disha, like 2 people, right? And so I think that again, benefits are that like I get my hand in everything, right? I was helping a lot of people with a lot of stuff, and that helps you learn. I think, especially your first job at a school, like the learning is more important than anything else, and so it benefited me that way. But the the differences were that there's very little red tape. I didn't. There's no massive chain of command, right? You don't have to go through a million hoops to get something done. I don't gotta go through IT a million times or all these different things that come with bureaucracy and like having a hierarchy, which are some of the things that people don't really appreciate about kind of corporate jobs. And so the first job I moved to out of after Kansas City was I moved to Virginia, which is where I live now. I live in Alexandria, Virginia, outside of DC. And I worked for the MITRE Corporation. So the MITRE Corporation is like a really large. It's a company that manages FFRDCs. So they pretty much do government consulting, but it's not for profit. So, but it's akin to like IBM, Deloitte, any of one of these large companies, but we primarily focus on public sector work. So I think some of the differences between Royals and MITRE was also because even this domain was very unique because I was cleared, right? So I worked on classified problems, and when you work on classified problems, like it's its own like very unique thing. You have to work in a skiff. That you don't have access to as much access to open source technology, right? There's a lot more compliance regulations and things like that, particularly when you're dealing with sensitive information. So that kind of led to part of it, but I would say like the biggest difference between working for a large company and working there and working in baseball was just like the amount of like hoops I had to jump through to get access to like even just like compute models, different third party data vendors. You were pretty much like on your own unless you wanted to like wait for a ticket to like go up the chain, right? So I think that caused a lot of kind of grief for me because I think like one of the reasons why I like baseball and I just like this type of work in general is like being innovative, working fast, being able to like get prototypes out there, again, like see tangible results. And if I gotta wait, 8 months, a year and a half for something I'm working on to like actually be used to like either help a warfighter or do something real, that kind of frustrated me. The other aspect of it is like MITRE is like, I actually had like a real like my boss and then my boss's boss, and then we had like a group and like I had performance reviews, I had like structured performance reviews and like the things that you deal with when you're a large company, and it just like wasn't for me. It was like too many hoops, too much red tape, and I struggled a lot with missing baseball. At least the super positive parts of baseball. I think it's important to note that I didn't leave baseball because I didn't like the work. I left baseball because you work a shit ton and you don't get paid that much, and I needed a life outside of work. Like that's really why I left. So that's an important caveat here. But yeah, I would just say like the red tape and the bureaucracy and like the lack of autonomy and the lack of immediate impact really was the culture shock stuff that I really struggle with.
Which then I think, is a perfect segue. You kind of did your next pivot there. So you went on from working at MITRE to working at Unstructured, which, for context, Unstructured is now used by 82% of Fortune 1000 companies. It's a fast company, number 24 most innovative company, raised $40 million in Series B, and you were employee number 13 at Unstructured.
Yeah.
So you moved on to unstructured, and it's funny because there's all those memes where it's like, all my life I've wanted to turn unstructured data
Yeah.
into actionable business
Yeah. Insights.
results and insights.
Yeah.
But quite literally, you moved on to a company called Unstructured, and you're still, we're working on data science. But I think this is the point in your career where you really got to work on building models from the ground up at scale. So I want to talk to you about your perspective of like being a part of a company at such an early stage and being kind of ahead of, in my opinion, the curve on AI, because I would say that ChatGPT launched around end of 2022, and quite honestly, I would say it wasn't until this year, early 2026, that things started hitting this exponential curve of requiring data to be cleaned effectively, usable, and provided to people and consumers at scale. So and to have that work properly, to everything we were saying earlier about the math kind of working, having the models be functional and usable, there's a lot that goes into making that work. So moving into unstructured, what did you focus on there, and kind of what was generally your thought process on moving over to unstructured, and kind of the work that you decided to do then after?
Yeah. So I left MITRE, I don't know, maybe 2022, something like that. And so some of the work I was doing at MITRE was building a what's called a knowledge graph, which all it is it's a one way of structuring information so that you can reason about it. So if you have a graph, is just an entity that has nodes and edges, right? So think of a social network. You have you're a node, you have friends, there are other nodes, and you have a link between yourselves that says, hey, this person's friend, right? And then you can build that out to like pretty much map the semantic layer that you're interested in, right? Whether it's a social network, whether it's Spotify, and you want to know how people listen to music, all these different type of things, right? So we were doing that for a government use case, and one of the major challenges, and this is a common requirement that a lot of people have, is how do you build those type of structured knowledge graphs from unstructured data? So unstructured data is anything that like pretty much like cannot be neatly put into like a CSV or Excel file or like a SQL database, right? It has SQL databases and those type of tools are like structured like columns and rows. The rows have headers. Everything in the column has the same data type. Those type of things, right? It's very structured. The benefit of that structure is that you can make assumptions, and because you can make assumptions, you can do very optimal queries for certain types of use cases, right? So SQL databases are like prevalent everywhere. Everybody uses them. But the problem we had was we had to build this knowledge graph from PDFs, right? So there's PDFs, a lot of PDFs that are really important. And remember, like PDFs, up until like the Gen AI movement, all these types of documents, PDFs, PowerPoints, anything you build, they were meant for human consumption, right? And they were built by humans, right? So there wasn't a thought of like, oh, I'm going to build this and you're going to scrape it, right? It was just like, oh, I have a presentation, I'm gonna make this PowerPoint or PDF, right? So processing PDFs and PowerPoints has become a massive problem because so many people want to be able to build knowledge graphs or some type of index or storage that allows you to interact with that data through large language models and Gen AI. And but you to do that, you need to be able to get these PDFs into a format that these systems can deal with and manage and interact with. And so I was dealing with this problem. And the way I dealt with it at MITRE was I was writing super brittle, this is before all the coding assistants, like I was writing from scratch, all these super brittle like pipelines for how you deal with these, and they break nonstop, right? So when I was looking for a new job, this kind of opportunity came up because I'm cleared, and so that they could do some benefits because it's tough to get cleared talent. So they literally hit me up and was like, hey, like this is what we're working on, and it was very easy sell for me because I actively deal with this problem, right? And so what Unstructured does is they're a kind of unified toolkit for being able to pre-process and do ETL, or pretty much do the ingestion of this type of data into some type of downstream database at scale for many different file types, kind of through a very simple conformed kind of API interface, right? So if you want to be able to process a PDF or a PowerPoint or an EPUB or an image or any type of file, right? You would have to write custom pipelines to handle all those different file types, right? And so what Unstructured does is they give you a toolkit where it's the same API interface. You send any document and they give you a structured JSON schema that is kind of unified and always consistent that you can then send to destination connectors like a graph database for a knowledge graph, Neo4j, something like that, or a vector database or SQL database or just Elasticsearch, anything, right? And so that's what we do. And so when I joined Unstructured, they were getting a lot more work in the public sector, right? So public sector again is like government, intelligence community, FedCiv, so that includes like Department of Energy, stuff like that. And so they're getting a lot more interest because all these government files have just share points of massive amounts of these PDFs and like human consumable documents that they need to be able to ingest and be able to generate insights from them without having somebody go find them, right? A very common use case that's very simple, but everybody has to do it is enterprise search, right? Which is just like, I have all this shit ton of documents. How do I find what I need, right? And so a lot of the Gen AI capabilities are not just around large language models, but this kind of retrieval step to be able to kind of fulfill and give context to large language models. And so that's what we do. And so a lot of my work has been, I started off in public sector working on like contract work. The way you can think about these contracts is like it's paid R&D, but we are a company that's trying to build a product, right? And so the goal is that it's paid R&D to build out, to use kind of the toolkits that we had. We started off as an open source Python package. Then we became a SaaS API. A SaaS REST API is pretty much just like we host it for you. You just send requests, so you don't have to deploy anything. You just send it. Like SaaS API, SaaS tools are around everybody. Any software as a service where you sign up and you just like hit it or go to it on a UI, that's a SaaS product. So we started off as an open source Python package, became a SaaS product, and now we're a no code platform. But the idea is like, how do you modify and add features to these ingestion tools to be able to support variety of warfighter and government use cases? And so that's what I did a lot. I also did some work outside of the government. I did a lot of work for like a Fortune 5 food and beverage company to be able to help them. This is a really good use case and a very clear kind of example of how this can be very powerful, which is they pretty much had they have a bunch of like, they paid McKinsey and all these, people that, cost a ton of money and give you PowerPoints. And they paid all these people to do market research around like what are people doing with food and beverages, right? Like examples like Matcha. Like Matcha's gotten so big, right? And on TikTok and stuff like that, right? So they're doing analysis of like all these different food and beverage trends, and they were storing it in these, again, human readable documents that were never made for machine consumption. And they want to be able to understand insights from these documents to be able to identify novel product ideas, right? And so how do you actually do that? How do you even like ingest this data and get in a format where you can then build a workflow on top of that to come up with novel product ideas? And so normally a human process with the domain experts that really have been in this space for a long time, it would take them, several months. Only the really rich brands could do it. And it was just a pain in the ass. And like kind of what we were trying to build for them was in a way to do this in a much slower, shorter cycle of time, automatically and technically cheaper because you don't need as much manpower. So like every brain can do it, right? And so these are common use cases that you see across public sector or private sector, and that's what Unstructured does. They do that type of work. And so I think I would say like my major role now, I head public sector research, trying to find out, kind of have a feeling of where the models are going. Obviously, every week a new update happens where, Claude puts out a new model, one of these other places put out a new model, and the functionality and the capabilities are becoming better and better. But at the same time, they're kind of harder to harness in a way, right? And so how do you build these new types of, how do we modify ingestion for the more complex capabilities that these models have so you can power real Gen AI applications that fulfill real business use cases? An example that we're working on, that a lot of people are working on is like, if you have a bunch of inputs coming in that are emergencies, like 911, think about 911, right? You have all these calls coming in, right? How do you actually automatically have one operator be able to handle all this volume by only alerting them to the relevant information that they need, or like prioritizing by like, this person's really in trouble to like, this person is just like calling about some bullshit, right? And so like, how do you do that? Right? Well, you need to be able to ingest all these audio calls, enrich them with metadata to understand like, this is serious, this is not serious, understand if there's like domestic abuse involved, like all these type of things, right? And so that's what we provide. And each domain, each use case is different. And so how do you actually distill each use case into reusable requirements that we can build into a product that we can then resell and make money off people, right? So that's kind of what I do now.
Yeah, and I want to get back to the current day kind of models and how quickly they're adapting. But before I do so, one thing I want to focus on. So you talked about like the matcha piece. Matcha's everywhere,
Mm-hmm.
and then Dubai chocolate is everywhere, right? I saw Dunkin' has Dubai chocolate now.
Mm-hmm.
Like the way that products are decided to be added into inventory now, I think the kind of feedback loop of how fast companies just start adding things to their menu has become a lot faster. And part of that reasoning is because they're either using models or they're using all the data that they have and seeing what's happening within the market, bringing it back into what they're selling, and then again predicting what they believe will perform well. So Before jumping into kind of more of the work that you're doing at the moment, I do want to talk to. I have a coworker. He always mentions this. It's a running joke now. He studied abroad, where he left and he came back. You did study abroad a little bit, and you successfully exited a company of your own, and you worked on some side projects. And I want to ask you some fun questions there. One of the things that I think is really interesting, you're talking to, like, again, ingesting all this information, making it discernible, making it valuable, and then outputting some form of prediction or some form of outcome that you can actually act on. One of the things that you did in your time studying abroad was you built Sports Capital, which Sports Capital was a real-time event detection system based on unstructured news, and it was a classic NLP meets system problem.
Mhm.
From what I've read up on it, you had 563 news sources. It was multimodal, and you had 8.1 second median latency. So you're building this model to ingest a ton of sports information. You built it to provide API or data context, and you successfully exited the company. So what did it look like building something like this from the ground up?
Yeah, so there's a interesting so okay, so Sports Capital initially started as a side project, right? So the project was called Project Stanley. That was a company that was started by the CEO of Sports Capital and a couple other guys that were already working on a project, and it was around pretty much building like a platform for managing salary caps for National Hockey League (NHL). And then from there, we pivoted to this idea of how can you ingest public open source intelligence about breaking news in sports to be able to make actionable decisions specifically in sports betting. How do you ingest real time information coming off Twitter, social media, blogs, podcasts that were talking about, injuries, lineup availability, trades, all this type of information? How do you ingest that to make it actionable? Because right now, at the time, and even still mainly now, sports betting companies like FanDuel, BetMGM, these type of companies, they have like pretty much like a trading floor. It's literally like a NASDAQ, like Wall Street trading floor. But instead of like stocks and bonds, they have like college football and like MLB, right? And pretty much what they do is if you're on FanDuel or BetMGM, they have people that like what they call like traders or like operators, where they're managing their responsibilities of lines. So if somebody has NBA, right, they're looking at all the games that are going on and watching and have Twitter up and other news sources they have up. They have like a big monitor set up, and they're trying to manage like risk and uptime by reacting to breaking news and bet flow. So one of their responsibilities is like, okay, like if everybody coming in, all the commercial people betting on our line is like hitting the under or like are hitting one side of the line, like how do you use that information to like recalibrate your pricing? Because that probably means your pricing is off, right? The other aspect of it is how do you react quicker than the rest of the commercial people, the regular people, to breaking news. So let's say LeBron gets injured, right? If LeBron gets injured and everybody gets it before you, they're gonna hammer his under, right? Then he's not gonna hit his props, right? So how do you react to that news quicker so that you don't get killed by what's called sharp bettors, which is like the really good bettors that know what they're doing, right? But it's a balancing act, right? Because you want to be able to modify your line so you don't get killed. At the same time, every time you take down a line to modify it, the uptime goes down, and the user experience for the users on the BetMGM app sucks, right? Because the lines are always down because you're recalibrating them, right? So the idea is how do you do this kind of automatically, where you're able to ingest news coming in and know what to do, right? And so what we pretty much built was we built a real-time ingestion system. It's mainly surrounded by Twitter because that's where real-time breaking news in sports happens, which is the main use case. And so pretty much we would ingest information from beat reporters, people on the sidelines, people at practice, all these different types of people. Adam Schefter, Woj, all the big guys as well. And pretty much we would ingest the data and it says like Patrick Mahomes just seen limping off at practice, right? And we would do a bunch of NLP. NLP is natural language processing, which is pretty much processing text. So we would take that text, which again, it just starts as a tweet. You can't really do anything without manual effort from just getting a tweet on your Twitter feed, right? But if you ingest that tweet and then do a bunch of enrichments, for example, it says, okay, we know that this tweet's talking about Patrick Mahomes. Not just that it's Patrick Mahomes, the name, but that's Patrick Mahomes, number 15 on the Chiefs, right? So you have to not only identify, possible entities, but link them to the exact player, team, staff, or coach or whatever that you're interested in. And then also identify what type of event is it? Is it an injury event? Is it a trade event? Is it a suspension? Did somebody just get ejected, right? We pretty much built a completely in-house what's called entity recognition, entity linking, and pretty much event detection classification models to be able to do this in real time, so that pretty much as information was coming in, we were able to disseminate that information in a structured, enriched JSON object to downstream stakeholders. So the way it started was we had a pilot with BetMGM where their NHL traders, we had a UI, they were using the UI, and as information was coming in and populated, it would show up in the UI. You could filter, you could do some complex searches, and pretty much you could be alerted, and you can use that instead of Twitter, right? Because it's a curated feed for what you care about, right? You could search on all this metadata. That's another important aspect, right? You could search on players, you could search on the event type, you could search on timestamps, you could search on, who the reporter was, a bunch of different things, right? The way we approached it was trying to sell it directly to the sports books to be able to have them use it for their managing their trading floor. And so, when you do that, you go through this, excuse me for cussing, like you go through this, you go through this like cycle of B2B of like, okay, like you talk with the stakeholders that's going to trial it. Okay, they want to trial, right? Because when you're selling B2B, like meaning to another company, usually the contracts are large, right? They're paying $30,000, $50,000, and then obviously much more than that, depending on how valuable the product is, right? So they go through a massive, due diligence process, right? You have the stakeholder that trials it and they use it and they say, oh, it's great, it's awesome, right? But they're not the ones with the money. That's the biggest learning lesson. It's really nice when the user likes it, but you got to talk to the money man, right? And so the problem we ended up having was just like there was not as much alignment as we thought from the stakeholder convincing the money man to pay for this. And so once you get to the point where like, all right, you got to actually put your money where your mouth is and like sign for something, there was always problems, right? And that could be the way we pitched it, the way our trial was, a lot of different things. So that didn't work out. At the same time this is happening, prediction markets are becoming really, really hot, right? And so prediction markets are call sheet, poly market, all these things that you see on the news now, which like it's hard to like kind of explain. It was recent, so maybe everybody still remembers this,
I mean,
but like, it wasn't as
I
big
will
as
say
it is now.
also, Polymarket, Kalshi, and now even Robinhood, like sports betting has become extremely accessible to the consumer.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of conversation happening around it of like, is it like, are we trading stocks here? Like, is this just gambling? Like, there's a weird middle ground that I think we're still trying to figure out. And then also like, how do you curb inside betting or inside trading? Sorry. So I think there's a lot to figure out there. But I think most people are aware now of like what sports betting is and kind of these types of platforms.
Yeah, so like, yeah, you see ads all over the place, and like this is the argument, right? So the argument behind prediction markets is, and so prediction markets are not just for sports, right? What prediction markets are is any verifiable you're selling what's called a binary contract, right? Binary event contract, and if the outcome happens, right, it's something that has to be verifiable. Either it happened or it didn't happen. And if it happened, one contract is worth $1. If it doesn't happen, the one contract is worth $0. And then as information comes out, the market determines the price, right? And so that's why you're arguing it's a tradable asset, right? And then that's the difference. Like it's not gambling, even though it's gambling.
And one more thing, it's like such a weird form of contract.
Yeah.
But this is a question for the degenerate gamblers out there, which is everyone that's on these prediction markets and trying to make a quick dollar. I think it's very important to understand why these contracts are set at $1 and kind of a little bit on like how they function and the volume at which they're trading to actually allow the system to be in the wild and be something where you can profit off of.
Yeah. So a couple of foundational items are the reason why prediction markets are, so most prediction market volume is from sports still. So the argument is why would you trade on them? Why would you sports bet on a prediction market versus on FanDuel or DraftKings, right? And the point is that when you bet on FanDuel or DraftKings or go to a casino and bet, you're betting against the house, right? The lines that they give you plus whatever the odds are, plus 150 or whatever, those are juiced. And there are a lot of rules around how they can manipulate things and like take down markets so that even if something happens or a guy gets injured, you don't get paid, right? So you're betting against the house, and you go to any casino, those things are built so that you're gonna lose, right? The difference between that and prediction markets is that prediction markets is peer-to-peer trading. There's no house, right? It's like stock market, and the fact that if I want to buy 5 contracts of LeBron under 8.5 rebounds, if somebody's willing to sell me for the price that we both agreed to, then I can just buy it from them, right? And that's how you create a market. So an important aspect is like when you build any type of marketplace economy, you need demand and you need supply, right? So if you think about Uber, right? The only reason why Uber works is because for the retail experience, which is any one of us that needs a ride, right? The only way it works is that if I call for an Uber ride in a reasonable amount of time for a reasonable price, somebody will come and pick me up, right?
Right.
If the
There
wait
has
time,
to be a high enough match rate for it to actually function correctly. And
right,
everyone kind of knows the how frustrating it is when you're trying to get an Uber and it just doesn't show up, even if it's 10 to 15 minutes. Which guys again kind of goes to show the level of the level of technological kind of scale that we expect on a day-to-day basis,
yeah,
because we expect almost everything to be like
instant,
instantaneous. We
yeah,
want within a couple of minutes the thing that we are asking for and demanding for to kind of show up. And like even I face this, like I'm waiting 15 minutes at an Uber. When I was at Arizona, I was waiting for 15 minutes, and I'm accustomed to like New York where it's 2.
yeah.
And I was like, this is taking so long. But
It's
in
terrible.
reality, like 15 minutes is a very short amount of time. If you think of just 15 years ago, where you had to hail a cab and like to find out where the car is, or call a taxi company, or figure out all those things. So that match rate, I think goes to show the scale at which connecting the retailer to an outcome has become.
Yeah. So the concept is exactly the same for the way like stock markets and these type of trading like trading markets work, right? If I want to buy, 5 contracts of under 8.5 rebounds for LeBron, somebody has to be willing to sell me that, right? How do you always ensure that when any random retail investor wants to go buy or sell contracts, somebody's always there to take the other side? We take this for granted now because there's a lot of major companies for stock markets that do this. Citadel, Citizen, all these major players, but they're called market makers. But the idea is that these companies spend a shit ton of money on, top PhD people in quantitative finance, and they understand how to actually predict and build, marketplace models so that they're able to actually put up bids and asks, meaning I'm willing to buy or I'm willing to sell a ton of volume on either side of a bet, so that any random person that wants to be able to buy, a couple contracts, the market maker's always able to take your other side of the bet, right? And that's what creates what's called liquidity, right? Which is like a liquid market where buying and selling is very easy and the price is efficient, right? If it takes me, if I want to buy 5 contracts of LeBron and I have to wait for somebody to want to sell it to me for 30 minutes, like it's terrible, right? And so how do you always have liquidity available to buy or sell retail investors to support that level of liquidity or that level of trading volume? And then how that also by definition makes it so that price is efficient, meaning that the delta between what somebody's willing to pay and what somebody's willing to sell at is very close, because the market is like kind of identified from all this volume that this is the correct price, right? So you need market makers to have a healthy trading economy. And the problem initially with prediction markets was that there was no market makers, right? So trading on these systems was extremely slow. It was inefficient. Once you got in at a price, you couldn't get out of it very easily, right? And it made the experience really bad. Now, pretty much market makers, there's a couple major quant trading firms that are now getting into like sports prediction market making. And now like for NFL, for example, like money line for any of the major sports now is like pretty liquid, where like the spread is like maybe a cent, maybe 2 cents. And again, remember the prices go from 0 to 100 cents, right? Because if you get it, it's $1. And so the idea then became for us, just to tie this back to like kind of what we were doing, was once prediction markets became big, we pivoted to trying to be a B2B company where we're selling kind of our enriched data through an API interface to actually quantitatively trading ourselves, right? Which is like we get the injury information and then we short all the injured players' props on, right? And so we pretty much built that entire system to be able to ingest information, either sell it as a kind of data provider or trade on it ourselves. And then kind of as that matured in the last 3 months, we were able to sell the technical assets, which is like the underlying technology of this company, to a retail betting company called Outlier. They pretty much sell like a B2C. So like they sell a tool that any of us can go sign up for. They have different subscription tiers, and it's pretty much a dashboard with a bunch of different tools that help you as a retail individual sports bettor kind of bet better. And they now are going to integrate kind of our injury news ingestion system into their platform to be able to help their customers be able to trade effectively. So yeah, that's about to end in like a couple of weeks. And yeah, that's how it will be done. So yeah, that's kind of what I was doing in between kind of working on Unstructured.
What I find like awesome is that there's this through line constantly to Moneyball, and I think of the scene from The Big Short where he goes, "This is my quant." It's Ryan Gosling, and
Yeah,
he has a
yeah,
Chinese dude. And he goes, "This is my
yeah,
quant. Look at him."
yeah,
And I think with the kind of explosion of prediction markets and kind of the move where consumers now have also access to all of this data and are kind of hungry for information.
Mhm.
It is again that point of like the Uber. There's a high demand for things instantaneously being available and at scale and correct. I want to talk a little to kind of for what you built with Sports Capital. So talking to the 500 plus news sources, the low latency, kind of what went into that, and kind of what you, I guess, are the most proud of in terms of building a product of this nature.
Yeah. So I mean, so obviously not without getting into like the tech
Yeah, of
stack and
course.
stuff like
Yeah, yeah.
that, but like the gist of it, right, is like the couple key challenges, right? The first one is like, can you get valuable metadata enrichment? Like that is the critical linchpin of this entire system. The other stuff is like kind of more understood, like how do you build fast APIs? How do you use like, a cloud provider's built-in services like AWS to has a bunch of different services to help you do some of these things. You have to pay for it, but like, managed services to help you speed up certain stuff. But the more important thing is like, how do you actually think about enrichment that's valuable? So when I say enrichment, I mean you have a piece of text. How do you add tags to it? Or how do you add other pieces of information that are derived solely from this original text that you can then filter on or use to make actions? And so I guess directly, the thing I'm most proud of is that we were able to go from nothing to multiple, where I would argue very high quality, low latency, natural language processing models that we trained completely in house, labeling everything completely in house, that was effective enough for us to be able to prove that we can be profitable by making decisions completely automated, right? So the important part is if you're going to use any of these models in any type of use case to make decisions without a human in the loop, right? Like you have to be very confident, right? Or at least the threshold for error has to be, you have to be able to live with that depending on what it is, right? If it's like a cancer diagnosis, obviously that's a much higher severity of like, if you're wrong, it's a big deal. And how you're wrong also matters, right? In cancer, I'd rather tell somebody that they have cancer when they don't, so they get checked out and we figure out they don't have cancer, than I told you didn't have cancer and you did, you never got treatment, right? So one of those errors is much worse than the other one, right? And so this is where like converting business requirements to a real, technical requirements is important. But what I'm really proud of is like when we were trading, or we were automatically trading, meaning like on an NFL Sunday, like shit was just popping off where like we were making trades completely automatically and we were able to prove that we were profitable. Like I don't think that's a small feat. And that was completely because the metadata that we had was extremely reliable. Meaning when we said it was an injury, it was an injury. And this is extremely difficult when you have to do this cross sport. We supported 5 different sports: NHL, NFL, MLB, NBA. WNBA, right? And like the important part of this too is not just the metadata of like, oh, this is an injury, but like who is the injured person, right? If they say, oh, Johnny's injured, or like Mr. Smith is injured, right? That could be any Mr. Smith, right? If there's a guy, especially in baseball, if the guy's last name is Sosa or Castro, there's like 30 Sosas and Castros that it could be, right? How do you actually identify with high confidence is this one? Because what if there's 3 guys that are really good players with that same last name and you trade on the wrong one? Then you're losing a ton of money, right? And so I think there was a lot of the what we went into it was the enrichment part of it, the enrichment pipeline, which is taking a piece of text, identifying who actually the relevant entities were, and then also the event detection was at the entity level. Meaning if a tweet came out saying that Jalen Brunson hurt his ankle stepping on Jason Tatum's foot, right? 2 entities, Jason Tatum, Jalen Brunson, only one of them is injured. But body parts have been mentioned for both of them. How do you actually automatically say that Jalen Brunson's the injured one? It's not Jason Tatum, right? So I think that I'm really proud of the entire enrichment. We completely did it in house. There's probably the biggest use case for large language models that I've found, which is synthetic labeling, which is how do you actually label and create a label data set to build a machine learning model without dedicated sports domain labelers, right? Also, like what actually constitutes an injury? Right? Is it if a guy says, "Oh, this guy just came back from an injury a couple weeks ago," that's not an injury. If a guy says, "Oh, he hurt himself 2 weeks ago and he's back," that's not an injury. A guy is a little hobbled, but he gets up and he doesn't leave the game. Is that an injury? I don't know. Is that an injury you want to trade on? Is the real question, right? And so these kind of nuances were really difficult, and we had to codify those and be able to build a system that again was trading completely automatically without anybody's involvement, and that I'm really proud of.
The thing that I find really interesting though, so even with your success and the kind of level of complexity that you built with this system, one thing that I've noticed is that through your work, you're still not as bullish on LLM based work and
Yeah.
are more bullish on knowledge graphs. And I want to get your take on working on a project like this that is much more LLM focused versus kind of, I think you have more of this natural gravitation towards knowledge graph building and why that has consistently showed up in your work and kind of how you're now taking into consideration in an LLM world knowledge graphs and everything kind of that you work towards.
Yeah, so I would just say like they're separate tools, right? They're not like replacements for each other, right? Large language models are a model where you can give it input and it gives you output, right? Knowledge graphs is a way of structuring. It's no different than it's like a database, right? How you structure the information to be able to do complex reasoning is what a knowledge graph is for. And there's certain use cases where it's clearly a graph, like we talk about social network. That's clearly a graph, right? Spotify, clearly a graph, right? But there's other things that are not so clearly a graph, but if you structure it as a graph, you can do extremely interesting insights. A really good example of this is in like medicine on like how like I don't know exactly how it works, but pretty much like how molecules and genes like mutate and change. You can look at a molecule as like as a graph with like connections between them and bonds between them, and they're able now. This is what like kind of Google has like pioneered, where they're able to pretty much identify by structuring that problem as a graph, and it's not intuitive to do this. You can actually use graph algorithms to predict how it will evolve and change, and they're using that actively to discover new medicine, right? And so I think that the idea is simply that graphs are one way to structure information, where if you can do it in a smart way, where the graph, the edges, and the way you construct the graph has a lot of value, you get just access to all the graph algorithms, right? When you structure something as a graph, you get all the graph algorithms. Shortest path, community detection, page rank. You don't know page rank is how, originally how Google helps you identify when you search something, what comes up, right? They have a network of all these pages and the links between, if a hyperlink on one page links to another page, you get two pages as nodes and you have the link as the edge between them, and you can traverse this graph to do really cool stuff, right? And so the value of knowledge graphs is that you can structure in a way where you get access to graph algorithms so you can do really complex reasoning. Now, the reason I'm not that bullish, I want to say I'm not bullish. I mean, I use, especially for coding, like LMs are pretty incredible, right? I would say the thing I think is overstated is how difficult it is to move a toy demo that you make using a large language model to a real production use case that is reliable, doesn't hallucinate, and is actually solving a real business problem. I think people completely understate anybody can make a little demo that works on one problem. Once you go to like production or at scale or with real money involved, it's not the same. It's really difficult, and it requires, a lot of times these people that are doing this successfully are people that have extreme amounts of Gen AI domain expertise. Like a lot of these companies that are doing this successfully, they have like real innovators in the space, not like I don't do this and like there's like an easy like application where I can just use my domain expertise with no technical experience to be able to build one of these products. And like one of the biggest things, like a lot of articles, we talk about this a lot, like articles coming out saying like, the return on investment on a lot of these like AI projects is either negative or really not what people need it to be. And like, is it a bubble and all this type of stuff, right? In regards to what you were kind of saying, my leaning is towards yes. And the reason for that is because the amount of money it takes to like run these models, investment in R&D around these models and stuff like that is so high. And because people have yet to really move these out of demos to production reliably at scale across many different companies, I think a lot of people are net losing money, and like it's really difficult. I think you have to scope it. You have to scope large language model use extremely effectively, and you also have to learn how to prompt. There's like so many related skills you need to build to be able to use large language models effectively, that I just think that this idea that you can just like do it out of the box or you can do it really easily without extreme technical knowledge of how these systems work, and again, this is why the math is important, then I think that people really overstate that.
Yeah, I mean, in conversation, I would say like about a year ago when companies like Bolt and Lovable started becoming really popular, I made the prediction to you that I felt like they're going to collapse very quickly,
Mm.
and partially that being my, you know, minimal experience trying to build build an application. Building a full stack infrastructure that works at scale is not an easy problem to solve. And I
Mm,
think it is very understated, where you see all of this hearsay online, just like prompt your way to an app, and like you can make a demo, but you're not going to make a full company with a couple of prompts. It's just not that easy.
nope.
And I think this is a good segue into like current day. So I think in 2026, to you, who has been doing machine learning, who's been working in data science, has been, working on it, just like you don't know the difference between machine learning and AI and have been working in this space for so long. What does being a data scientist mean to you today? And then the other question I was going to ask is kind of how has all the tools that have kind of come to fruition impact the way that you do work on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah. So the first question, what does it mean to me, right? Like what does my role look like now as it's evolved, right? As like the tooling has evolved. So a couple things is I still think there's a massive gap in the AI coding ability when it comes to data science projects. I think that there's some new stuff coming out, like Karpathy, who's like big Tesla guy, one of the OpenAI founders. He put out this thing of like auto researcher, which I think is an interesting idea where you can build an agent to like do the evaluation loop for you. But I still think it's a very unsolved problem of how do you build machine learning models like completely automatically using code, which is like different from building like an API. An API, like a REST API, is a well researched, well understood. There's clear design patterns on how to do it. An LLM can do that pretty reliably. Like there's really no issues there, right? But when you have to build a custom model that requires a lot of like evaluation, a lot of feedback, and a lot of like examining outputs, it can help you do the exploration, but it doesn't automate the exploration, right? It doesn't automate the evaluation. And so I still think that this might be just me in my personal opinion. Like I found that like when I'm training models, it helps me actually like do the typing that I would normally do. But the thought process and how I think about it hasn't changed at all, pretty much, in terms of how intensive it is for me to think through it. And so I think that like a lot of my time is spent more on like planning, building documentation, kind of architecture diagrams of like what I think that this should look like and talking with stakeholders to figure out what that would look like. And then the implementation for me has now become so much faster. Like I have not written a manual line of code in probably got to be at least 6 months, maybe 8 months, right? Like I have not personally written any code
That's
outside of like coding agents,
Yeah, that's
right?
insane. So would you agree, Boris, who developed Claude Code,
Mm-hmm.
he on his recent like, run of podcasts and kind of all of the conversations he's had, has said multiple times that coding has been mostly solved.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that?
Yes, to an extent.
Okay.
I think that Claude Code implements things that are better than I can implement it. I believe that. What I don't believe though is that somebody with no software background can build scalable working applications just using these products, because I think that like again, like a lot of my work with like when I interact with the coding agent, like when I say I haven't written a manual line of code, that doesn't mean I'm interacting with the system, right? But the interactions are not like me typing like for loops, right? The interaction is I'm building markdown documents, natural language documentation that helps scope and hone and kind of target specific components and the specific features I want to build to make it so that the LLM is doing very simple, not simple, but very targeted tasks. What happens when you use large language models, if you just like start rambling and start giving it a lot of information, it gets a lot of context anxiety. You start filling up the context window, so it makes it harder to find relevant information. And the systems are it's very easy for people that don't have good software engineering principles to go off the rails and generate a lot of tech debt and confuse motion with like progress, right? If you could write a system and that's 2 million lines of code, but it has a lot of tech debt, it's hard to manage, it's hard to make updates to, versus one that's 2,000 lines of code and much faster, you take the 2,000 lines of code, right? It's not how much code you're writing, it's the quality of the software. And I don't think coding agents have fully solved that part of it. They still require you to think through the system, how you integrate with different code bases, all these type of things where because you can move much faster, it's much easier to spiral out of control. You need more like controlling and harnessing mechanisms, which is what people are working on. That is where the work is now, not like me actually implementing, a PyTorch training procedure, right? And so I would say it's solved in the fact that implementation, I can write stuff in Go that I don't know how to write Go, right? So like those type of things are solved. But if the definition of solved is writing production level software that for people that don't have software engineering experience, I wouldn't agree with it.
Like it's expedited the ability to get stuff done if you are maybe not the strongest at coding, but you still need a foundational understanding of how to build something from the ground up, which you can't prompt yourself into a company in the way that I think people are seeing on social media. So I want to ask you the question then, what are the tools that you are using the most often on a day-to-day basis now? And then what are the projects that you're working on or the most excited about?
Yeah, so right now, so I would also argue this is a fun, weird dichotomy that I talk about with you and my girlfriend a lot, which is like I'm pretty like technology like illiterate. Like
Like
I
hardware.
yeah, well like just like tools. Like you put me onto a lot of tools that like I never used
Okay.
before, right? So and so I think that like I would not argue that I'm like the most AI pilled person. But in terms of like the tools I use regularly, I mean, I kind of go back and forth between all the coding agents, mainly because they're all putting out new models, and so I want to like continually like understand how they're different and how they get better over time. I mainly use Claude Code for like all my coding related work. I have a Google like Enterprise account, so I use Gemini a lot for like non coding related tasks, like for like research, like just general like either personal admin research or kind of seeing what's going on. Another example of me using some of these tools is I used Claude heavily as a lawyer to help me during the sale of the company to understand like what am I giving up in IP rights, what am I giving up in like certain some of these aspects, and I it was so helpful that I was able to like only really talk to my own personal lawyer like only a couple of hours, which you normally would have taken me many hours, and the lawyer that we had for the company, he pretty much told me like you know a lot of his stuff already. I was like I literally just told him like he's like the information you have was right and it came completely from these tools, right? So it helped me. It's not just like coding and development. It helps me in a lot of other ways. It also helped me pick my benefits package for work and like what's the best thing for me given my health concerns, right, and my family and stuff like that, right? So, but yeah, I would say it's a lot of Claude Code. I use Claude Cowork. I use Gemini. I'm trying to think of what other major tools I use. You put me onto the script, which I'm starting to try to use now for like content creation. That's another thing. I started a Substack, so I'm trying to like help it. I'm trying to figure out how it helps me like create content in my own voice, which I think is probably one of the biggest gaps in large language models right now. Is like its ability to creatively write and like match kind of the tone that you have. That's why a lot of stuff on the internet now, the slop is all like generic. It all seems like it's written by the same person. The other thing is I've been using LM Studio a lot more. I think I was telling you about to run local models. So the problem is like if you want to do insurance stuff or like tax stuff, right? You don't want to send Claude or one of these open public APIs your personal information, your social security number, things like that. So there's a lot of tools now where you can run on like not even that much hardware. You don't need like a crazy amount of compute. Where you can run local models, and the local open source community has gotten so much better. Where the models are rivaling private sector commercial frontier labs. And so, but the benefit is that I can run on my own machine. Nothing leaves my machine, right? And so I've been using a lot more of those as not only coding assistants, but also being able to kind of deal with my own personal tax information, which I find pretty helpful. But yeah, I would say like those are really the main stuff that I'm using right now. At work, like we have like some helpful stuff like Gong and some of these like other Google Meet tools that help you summarize information, aggregate information, link to certain stuff. We have a lot of like Slack integrations that now like alert me when certain things are happening or like alert you when a customer meeting happened and allow you to kind of like distill that information without having to go to the source. So yeah, and I use like Notion and like some common tools that have AI features in them. The probably one of the biggest ones I used recently was Figma. You actually put me on to Figma. And Figma Make has like a new Gen AI tool where like you just natural languagely describe what you want to build, and it helps you build like a Figma prototype. Which, in my understanding, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is like a big upgrade from like you having to like actually like build the actual
Oh,
polygons and everything
massive. Yeah.
from what you had before, and like that helped me build like the initial version of a new project I'm working on. So
Yeah.
those are kind of major tools I've been using.
So before we get into what you're working on currently, one of the things I want to say is like the AI pill thing. I think I've been. It's funny because on my day job I'm working as a marketing person first, and I don't think you'd assume that a marketing person would be I think the best case or best use case for all of these AI tools, but I personally believe it is.
Hmm.
What I've found is that these tools are not meant to replace. humans. I think there's a lot of fear mongering that's happening around like AI
Yeah.
is going to replace everyone. I really don't think that's the case. I genuinely believe that the sentiment that I think a lot of people have been saying, it's like AI is not going to replace your job, someone using AI will. And
Yeah.
I firmly believe that. What I think these tools have allowed me to do personally is adopt and quickly adapt my workflows to be that much more expedited in how I can get to a first draft, a first iteration, getting something out into market. And I
Hmm.
think every conversation that I've had with people, like I hate being the guy that's like, oh, agentic AI. Like we get enough of that on a day to day basis. But I keep coming back to it in conversations because when I talk to people, it's like if you're in like the, late 90s, early 2000s, and you're like, oh, domains aren't important. Oh, the internet, oh, that's not, it's a fad. I truly believe we're at that inflection point where if people are not learning how to use these tools quickly, like you're just going to get
Yeah.
left behind and you're not going to be able to keep up with how fast you can get things done.
Yeah.
So I think that is a consideration that should not be taken lightly because it's not to say that like you should just be getting more work done, but it's the same as like why would we use Microsoft Word instead of handwriting something? It's because it's more efficient.
Yeah.
Why do we use email instead of sending mail out? It's more efficient. So I think it's really an efficiency play here, and why I think it's extremely important to figure out like where you can fit it into the work that you already do.
Real,
Uh,
real quick
yep.
point on that, like in regards to coding, but I think it expands to like what you're talking about. Is they've done a lot of research on do lower level like junior engineers or like senior engineers benefit more in terms of productivity from these type of tools, right? And that's an interesting question, right? Because one of the fear mongering things is like these tools completely remove the need for low level engineers, right? Which is why like kids coming out of college are like, what do you study now? You shouldn't study computer science and all this type of stuff, right? So that's one argument, right? But I think what actually happens in practice is that it expedites top level engineers much better because they have the principles and they have the understanding to use the tools more effectively and like kind of democratize their time more versus like if you don't have the skills and you try to do like allow these tools to like do all these things for you, we get into that spiral mode, right, where you actually become less productive, like less productive. So I think to your point, like it's also I think an important note part of it this is like there's no one way to use any of these tools, right? There are tools that you kind of have to because also the way you interact with them is natural language interfacing. The way you talk to Claude and the way I talk to Claude is completely different,
Oh
right?
yeah, I'll give Claude some sass. I know you're not giving as
Yeah,
much sass to Claude
yeah,
Claude as I am.
yeah. Don't mess this up. No mistakes, right? But like I think that's another part of it. Is like there's not like it's not like one way to do it. You have to find out like the kind of like principles and practices that you can use to help you with your job. The last thing I would say about this is like you have I definitely in the last year you have drastically I won't say like just the outlook, but like you have changed like how much you use these tools, like in the conversations that we have, and you have completely expedited how fast you move on like normal work, right? And that spans a lot of different things that you do, right? It's not just like one area, right? And so I think that I definitely would say like I think it's really valuable for non-technical people to be like getting involved in this stuff and helping you do your job more effectively because you'll be able to move faster and like particularly in startup environments like your main advantage is that you move fast, right? That's the advantage. We talked about like the MITRE and like how much red tape there is. Like that's the disadvantage you get when you're a large company. So I think that like it really helps startups, and we talk about this all the time. Like I definitely believe I think they already happened, but like there's gonna be a lot more like unicorn companies that came from one or two solo founders.
Yeah, yeah, 100%. And then I will say even like with the adoption of tools on my side, like I am as fast as I would say 5 people in a business environment on a personal level in comparison to what I can do at a business level because of the level of tool adoption that I can do personally and get to pick and choose what I want to use. And for anyone that's listening, I want to give like a little bit of a list of the things I'm working on with like not too much depth and just kind of talk to it. But
Hmm?
uh, Claude Code is kind of my go-to for all things coding now. I don't touch code anymore across websites for the most part or application development. Claude Cowork, it allows me to draft documentation. Even for the prep for this interview, I actually had it
Hmm?
scrape our previous interviews. I had it look through your LinkedIn. I had it look through some back and forth and conversations that we've had, and I had a drafted document together based on that and news sources, and then I looked over it on my own. I
Yeah.
use Gamma for presentation development, which is an AI presentation or PowerPoint creator. You can create a draft that's 20 to 30 slides designed within a couple of minutes of prompting. I use Whisperflow now on my desktop, which is a
Yeah.
click of a button to do speech to text for my prompting. My fingers are starting to hurt. I actually have like this little ball that I
Yeah.
keep here that I've told you about because like all the typing, this is a problem of a tech person. All the
Yep.
typing starts to bother my fingers, so I started using Whisperflow, where I just like press a button and I talk to my computer and I let my agent then go run in the wild and do things.
Hmm.
We're recording in Descript, which I do all my content creation in. So now content creation for me, the studio is in one spot, the editing is in one spot, the social media clip creation is in one spot. It also distributes out to all of the places that I put it out. Um, and the thing that has been, for me, like really exciting is that I'm kind of all over the place. So being able to have all of these tools allows me to do all of them at a higher rate and at a higher quality than I've ever been able to do before.
Yeah.
So that's what's super exciting to me. So now I'll throw it back to you. So we talked about kind of like the tools both of us are using, and I think both of us are still less on the side of fear mongering, more on the side of bullish because of what it allows us to do.
Hmm.
So I want to talk to kind of what you're working on right now.
So, so when I was working on Sports Capital, there was a year, pretty much all 2025, where I left to like pretty much work on Sports Capital full time, and now I'm back on Unstructured doing the public sector research. So in my spare time, still I'm working on some side stuff. So I kind of started my own brand, my own, I don't know what you call it. I guess it's a company. It's a LLC called PQ Labs, and so the goal kind of for long term, like this is a kind of a long term play a little bit, is that I have a lot of ideas about projects I want to work on in across many different domains like sports, music, politics, which we'll kind of get into. And so the real thing I care about is I want to be able to use these new AI tools that help me go a lot faster to be able to kind of solo build and like show what the experience is like using these tools to build like solo entrepreneur journey. And so the goal for PQ Labs is like to work on a couple different domains that like I have personal interest in, build data driven, machine learning, AI driven products that are extremely data intensive, that are doing complex algorithms. We're going to be building a lot of models, a lot of interesting stuff that I'm interested in. But I think an important part of research, it is meant to be like a research organization where we're trying to push the envelope, build state of the art stuff. But I think an important thing that research sometimes lacks is the rigor of businesses requiring somebody to pay for something, right? You can build something and it looks nice in a lab and it looks nice when you demo it. But the real test, I think that like it's kind of like the thesis of capitalism in a way, right? Is like, is somebody willing to pay for this, right? And that doesn't have to mean it's a lot of money, right? Just like somebody's willing, like this has enough value, I'm willing to spend my money on this, right? Or my time or whatever. And so kind of the goal is that we're gonna be building products that are businesses. The goal is to make a business, but I'm going to be documenting through Substack and hopefully through some papers and stuff like that, some of like the underlying interesting innovations on the technical side that I think people would find interesting and maybe can kind of take with them. The first project we're working on is this thing I'm calling string theory. The idea behind it is, if you've seen Always Sunny, it's like the meme of Charlie, like definitely looks like he's coked up, like pretty much on a board where you have, it's very common, like a lot of like investigation police kind of shows and movies where you have like a map and you have like pins on it to like be like all the major people and like red strings across them to show like the relationships between them. Again, sounds a lot like a knowledge graph, right? And so that's the idea, right? Like, how do you build an investigative like board like that allows you to explore and investigate the United States, currently federal, but long term also local and state level politicians, funding entities, legislation, voting records in a way that allows you to fully understand how all these things interact. The major like kind of catalyst for this is that everybody talks about politics with their friends and their family, and I think almost all of us agree it's an extremely toxic process, including consumption, which most of us are getting information from TikTok, from Instagram, and it's just like overloading, especially when it's like really negative imagery. But also the amount of misinformation, the amount of distrust, right? Even like reputable organizations that are editorial, meaning newspapers, podcasts, because of the current culture and the distrust that has been sown, nobody believes anything anymore, right? Even if it's correct, even if it's fully researched, right? And so because of that, it's made it an extremely negative experience to learn about, to consume this type of content, learn about what's going on. A lot of us care about what's going on in our country. Obviously, a lot of stuff is going on in the world right now with the Iran war, what's going on in Gaza, United States, the midterms are coming up in a couple of months. So a lot of things are happening and it's difficult to stay on top of it. Most people get that content from toxic sources and it's not fun. So the goal is pretty much to be able to kind of build a data-driven application where it's an alternative to consuming, social media-based content or podcast-based content for you to kind of be objective and explore this information about what's going on in our federal, kind of federal government through a easy to use UI application. Kind of the core tenets of it are there's kind of like four. It's like kind of like a 2x2. Everything is a 2x2, but like pretty much it's like people that know what they're looking for. So you can think of like social media influencers that make political content. People like Ben Shapiro, Tucker Carlson, Pod Save America, Zateo, Mehdi Hassan, those type of people that are really in the weeds. Their users are heavily engaged. They know what they're looking for, and they want to do deep research to be able to understand and build content or just share their opinions online, right? Or make articles and things like that. Then there's also kind of like the comment warrior, which is what I call them, is like the person that like gets into arguments on social media and they want to be able to send easy receipts from objective kind of data visualizations that are really kind of striking, that prove a point very easily without you having to go back and forth about my facts are better than your facts, right? The goal is that this is a fact-driven, non-editorialized way of consuming this content that hopefully becomes the standard for how people build arguments, right? Think about like the Rotten Tomatoes meter or any of these type of things where like, I'm not saying it's always correct, right? But the kind of, as a society, we have agreed that if something is higher than 90% on the Rotten Tomatoes meter, like it's probably a pretty good movie, right? And so we're not telling you what to think. The goal is that we're giving you building blocks and evidence for you to build on top of it and help you construct arguments. And the goal is that will make it so that these conversations that you have with your family over the dinner table or with people online or in the content you make is a lot more data-driven, receipts-driven, and objectives to help you build arguments that hopefully kind of the masses are able to get behind because this is trusted as an objective source.
Yeah, and I want you to do like a quick demo for me, but before I let you drive that, one thing I wanted to point out. So we both listened to a recent episode from the CEO of Snapchat. Sorry, the CEO of Snapchat, Evan, who was saying distribution is a moat. And one thing I wanted to kind of double. I hate that I'm saying double click. It's one thing that I want to focus more on is I want to say that a lot of news today is very much so driven by personalities within the space, whether that's on traditional mainstream media or non-traditional media such as podcasting. Distribution being the moat kind of ties into like OpenAI's acquisition of TBPN, the Technology Business Programming Network, which is just a live podcast. A lot of companies have gone through this kind of process of buying podcasts more recently because it's a way to get news and information and, in a lot of cases, biased perspectives out to the masses and allow them to ingest this information at a faster rate. So I think it's a very smart decision if you're trying to get a message or product out into the world. Bringing this back into politics and all the Gen AI applications, on top of the fact that most people are getting their sources in a curated, short form, from personality way. There is also the other side of this where Gen AI tools have allowed people to create content at scale, what is called, AI slop now.
Yep.
But in my experience working in advertising technologies, was historically a problem known as made for advertising, or sites that are just made to get advertising dollars and eyeballs. And across the board, attention is being sold. So at the same time, you have two things happening. You have your attention being kind of sold and attained at such a high rate, and then news that is consistently changing, that is hard to believe, and it is very easy to find yourself in a predicament where you're only ingesting information that is biased towards your perspective. So it is much harder to have a neutral conversation where you're talking to, as you're mentioning, the data-driven receipts. So I'm going to give it to you now to kind of do a little bit of a demo. I don't want to spend too much time in the weeds on it.
Sure.
But I do want you to run me through string theory, because I think this is something that people like really, really need. And what I'm going to do for anyone that's listening or like actually watches the YouTube video, goes to the comments, I'm going to drop your Substack because you're talking to kind of what you're building in real time. But yeah, you feel free to like share your screen and kind of show us what you're doing with string theory.
Sure. Yeah. One more comment about kind of what you were talking about too is that it's not even just like the echo chamber is also like deliberate, right? Because you're fighting the algorithm. The algorithm promotes rage baiting content, and extremely provocative content, and it promotes the echo chamber idea where you're only getting content from what you consume, right? Like it's a feedback loop, right? If you only follow certain people, if you only post certain things, you're gonna just get that type of content back, right? So like you're also not just like it's not just like you're fighting the algorithm. The tech companies are like building this into their products, but yeah. So
Yeah,
so
I
this
mean that's also a concern. As a content creator, I've struggled with this where it's like creating the rage bait content over the edutainment type content is much easier to grow.
yep.
Because like you're gonna get engagement. So it's a very weird web that we've weaved. But yeah, I'll give it to you to
Exactly.
to talk to string theory.
Yeah, so again, this is a kind of a beta version. It's free beta, anybody can sign up. But yeah, the idea is that like we want to be able to distill the process into kind of common search patterns that people want to look at, right? So kind of the main entities that are involved in this whole ecosystem, right, are politicians, which is the main people that we care about, the people we want to hold accountable, who's representing me, those type of people, right? Then there's actually votes, which is how are my politicians voting on relevant legislation that's happening right now. Then there's the actual legislation itself, right? What is in this bill, right? Right now, all of us, I guarantee all of us, get perspectives on the big, beautiful bill or any of these type of legislation from these editorialized, biased people. But I've never, until this product, I never actually read a bill before and actually saw like what actually is it and how do you actually understand what it is for yourself of what's in there, right? And so, yeah, politicians, how they vote on legislation, and then there's the money aspect, which is the big thing. Because the Citizens United and the way that the United States kind of political system works, money investment into politicians from super PACs, from individual rich donors, from different people has a massive impact on what happens, right? You have people that are paying for access to politicians to be able to get policies that they want. For example, if you're somebody who sells weapons sells weapons, or you're a weapons manufacturer, you're probably pro-war, right? And so understanding how these things happen and who's supporting who and how all these things impact each other is the goal of this product. Right now, in its current state, kind of the initial version, we talked about this. It's mainly for power users right now, which is a clear gap. It's meant for people that kind of know what they're looking for and want to be able to investigate specific topics. The goal is as we build more and more Gen AI features, summarization features, natural language processing metadata like we talked about before, predictive analytics, things like that, that will be a little bit easier to distill that into like simple headlines that people can go investigate further if they need to. So if you don't know what you're looking for and you just want like a news feed to be able to stay up to date on what's happening, it becomes a lot easier. But yeah, that's the goal. And then the goal is eventually, again, this is structured as a knowledge graph because you have entities that are funding politicians voting on bills are going through Congress, right? You can be able to use all the graph algorithms at your kind of disposal to be able to answer some of these complex questions, right? Like which senators are voting on what way on a certain bill, how did certain people that were funded by AIPAC vote on Israel related bills, right? Things that are common that people want to know and want to be able to identify the thread and pull the thread between how these things are connected. That's kind of the goal. So,
and then sorry, can you just zoom in a little bit just to make it a little easier to see here?
Yep. Let me know if that's better.
Yeah, that's much better.
Okay, so a couple of real quick, I'll kind of walk through kind of the three main tabs real quick, but I want to just highlight like kind of the real kind of ethos, the tenets that this like kind of product lives by is that we care about actions, not rhetoric. A lot of people post stuff on Truth Social, on Twitter, on podcasts about what they're doing. We care about actions. You said you were going to support something. Did you actually do it? Well, we can actually get that in actions, right? And actions obviously speak a lot louder than what people say to pander to different bases, right? The other one is primary sources. These are not opinions. These are raw, real, official sources. And the benefit of living in the United States is that there's a lot of transparency on how public officials move, how they vote. All these things are public record, right? And so we're using primary sources legally like provided by the government, and they have to provide this for transparency. The other thing is we don't try to spin narratives, right? We're showing you the entire raw information. The goal is for you to build a narrative off for yourself based off the raw information. And then the other idea is that we don't tell you who's bad, who's good. We don't make comments about, what's right or what's wrong. It's about facts, and then you build arguments that are logical yourself, right? And so kind of going through a couple of these key entities, right? So one of them is politicians, right? This is like kind of the key part. You have your executive branch, which is, so an important thing to note when you're using this product is that Congresses are numbered by every 2 years. So we're currently on the 119th Congress. Eventually, you'll have historical Congresses, so you'll be able to go and do historical research. So that's coming right now, which is backfilling right now. But you have the executive branch, which obviously currently the president is Donald Trump. The vice president is J.D. Vance. So for presidents, you can see that he has 457 executive orders already signed in this Congress. Sorry, this is historical actually. This is how many executive orders he signed in his entire presidency, including his first presidency term. You have how many bills he signed into law. You have how many vetoes he has. And then for J.D. Vance, the main congressional power that vice presidents have is breaking tiebreakers in Congress, which he has used multiple times, which is pretty interesting to look at. Right? You have because this Congress spanned in 2025, this predated Trump a little bit. So you still have other, obviously the president and vice president from the previous administration that left during the same Congress. But the idea is that you have all these different members of Congress that you're able to filter and sort on, right? So you can see, for example, you have Angela Brooks, right, who's from Maryland. She's a senator. She's not on the ballot in the midterms. Alan Armstrong is. He just actually became the Oklahoma senator because Markwayne Mullins was just promoted to the head of the DHS because I forgot the lady, Christine Ohm, got ousted as the DHS secretary. So because Markwayne Mullins, who's from Oklahoma, got promoted, they needed a new senator, and that's where Alan Armstrong came in. That's why he has no picture. He's brand new, no bills, stuff like that, right? But what you're able to do is you're able to search through this. You can sort on who's been most active, who has the lowest amount of loyalty, who has the highest amount of loyalty, right? You can see Rand Paul, who's a libertarian. He often disagrees with the Republican Party, even though he's Republican, right? And so you can see bipartisan, which is how many people sponsor bills, meaning I'm actively pushing this bill into Congress with people from the other side of the aisle, right? So this is very common. For example, Thomas Massey, this is historically was for the Epstein files. He worked with Ro Khanna to be able to, who's a Democrat, to be able to push the Epstein kind of compliance act to make it so that the government had to put out information, right? So his bipartisan percentage is pretty high. But you'll notice that none of these are that high. And that's because that shows you the state of politics in the US now, where most people are voting on across party lines, right? So if you go to the executive branch, to Donald Trump, you can see their presidencies. You can go to executive orders, where you're actually able to see newest executive orders that they actually just put out. So this is the one that we were talking about a while before, which is about psychedelic drug use in treatment, particularly for veterans and people with PTSD.
Yeah, I mean, that's, we talk about the distribution moat, man. Joe Rogan's distribution is
Exactly.
so high that he's out here getting into government and making changes at the federal level and just
Like
at the
texting
Oval
Trump.
Office.
He
By
texted Trump.
which is absolutely
Yeah.
insane. I couldn't imagine that podcasting would be here, and that's where what Rogan would be doing.
Right.
But this is, to your point, like the actual evidence or the kind of pull of what is truly happening behind the scenes of the government. And I think most people, myself included, before you showed me some of this stuff, have never gone to like Congress.gov and like pulled the actual bill of the process that's happening in the background. So jump a little bit into kind of like what this actually is.
Yeah, so the goal is right now we have a lot of places where we link to Federal Register. Federal Register is where executive branch related things happen, right? Executive orders are only done by the president, so that's where Federal Register comes in. But the idea is that we have links to a lot of these different things, so you can send it to people, see the collateral for yourself. The goal is we're also ingesting the raw text here, which is going to be able to power long-term NLP processing, right? So for example, if you wanted to be able to filter executive orders based off ones that only mention, psilocybin or, ibogaine or all these different compounds, right? You would be able to do that, right? Ones that affect veterans, ones that affect some of these things, right? Right now, none of these things have these raw tags, right? But it'd be really helpful if you're somebody that was looking for what are all the executive orders that Trump has signed related to certain topics. Cryptocurrency is a big one right now, right? Like kind of what's happening here, right? So this allows you to kind of link to that. You also have sign into law, which is obviously the president is the one that signs stuff into law. So once something gets agreed upon by Congress, passes Congress, then it goes to law and he signs them in. And then you can even see, like, I didn't even notice he had one veto. It's this vote, right? And so it'd be pretty cool to see like kind of what happened in this vote and kind of what was going on. So from here, you can, like we said, you can click on any of these. It takes you there. The other thing is you can click on any of these laws and it shows you what's called the bills page, which is this bills page here. Remember, we started on politicians. Now we're on bills by linking to the bill that he signed into law. And you can see the full trajectory of what happened, right? You have who sponsored it, right? You can see that if it's a yellow dot, that means that they're the main co-sponsors. And then this guy's like a secondary co-sponsor. This came from John Thune. You have the full timestamp and like timeline of what happened, individual information. Some of these things need to be kind of cleaned up. This is all raw information. I'm still learning about, we talked about before, like how do you translate non-technical problems to technical requirements? I don't even know what metadata is important here, right? So I'm trying to figure out, like, do we link to this? Do we not link to this? So this is kind of the hope, is that by putting this out to the public, we can see how people are using this, how regular people who are involved in politics across the spectrum, from just people that argue on social media or people that kind of consume it and don't really consume it, to people that are really involved in this, how would they want to be able to research this information and find new things to talk about? The hope is that kind of the feedback page will kind of get some information around that, about what we're looking for, and anybody that's signed in can leave feedback on any issues that they see. But yeah, you have the entire flow of everything that happened. You can see that this was passed and agreed under unanimous consent, without any voting, right? I didn't even know that some things don't even go to votes. They just like verbally say, hey, all right, we don't need to vote, like it's all good, right? And then you have, Senate, you have roll calls, which allow you to kind of see how votes happen. And then you also can see that it passed 384 to 40. Remember, this is the House, so there's a lot more members. And then what you can do is you can actually go to this event and you can see raw information and then go into the chamber view, right? So this is what's called the Congress floor. And what you see here is you can actually search for bills and see exactly how these bills were voted on. So for example, here, all the greens are people that voted yes or pass or yay. And then all the reds are people that voted nay, right? And you can clearly see that almost all the Democrats on the left side is Democrats, they all voted except for this person. And then there's a lot more dissent among the Republicans, right? And you can see individual voting history. There's only one vote here. You can view the full bill, which is what we just did. You can read it on congress.gov, which is like the main kind of source for this type of information. And the really interesting thing is that you can do some pretty interesting analysis on like what happened across bills changing to understand why stuff got passed. So a good example of this is the Big Beautiful Bill. I learned this literally by playing around with this product, right? So you can search for things like One Big Beautiful, if I can spell, right? So One Big Beautiful, right? It's actually called the One Big Beautiful Act. I didn't know that. It's not called the One Big Beautiful Bill, right? So what you see is here, right? So what happens here is, obviously this was a highly contested bill. A lot of us know kind of this was probably the flagship bill. That's why it was HR 1, which is like the first House representative bill under this Congress or under this administration. And so what you'll see here is that this goes back and forth between the Senate a bunch of times, right? And what you'll see here is the initial versions, all the Democrats vote no, Republicans vote yes, mostly. Rand Paul, again, our number one defector, said no, and so did Tom Tillis. But then what you'll see here is that, again, still all party lines, and then it switches, right? Something happens between here and here in the bill that switches it. So now all the Democrats are voting yes, and all the Republicans are voting no, right? And obviously because Republicans control Congress right now, if all the Republicans vote among party lines, it will pass, right? And so this is an interesting thing. I'm going to have a write-up about this soon, about like kind of what happened here. But the question is, like, how do you actually analyze like what exactly happened here and how the evolution of this bill happened? Because you can see this has tons of votes, which means that they were constantly editing it to get it to kind of go through. And this was like part of the government shutdown. This is this is a big part of the last year of this kind of bill going from July 1st to it being kind of fully passed. The last thing I want to show you real quick about this is if you go to the full bill, which takes you to the bills page, right? You can see all the amendments and kind of when we have available data, what these amendments were actually doing, right? You can see who was involved with that amendment. And then the last part at the bottom is you can see the actual full text over time as it went through each of these different processes as it was amended to get it to a point where it was public law and enrolled, right? And so the goal is, obviously this is not easily easily readable, but the goal is to add a lot of enrichments and Gemini stuff around this so you can investigate this bill and answer that question that I personally have, which is like, what the hell happened here? Where every Republican voted, it was polarized, every single vote, but then they switched. They all voted yes and they all voted no within one change, and I'm trying to figure out what happened. So these are the type of kind of like investigations and like kind of thorough analysis that you can do. The other nice thing is in the sources page, we tell you where we get all the sources from, when they were last synced. So obviously this is an extremely data intensive product. And so the goal is to expose and be transparent about where we have gaps, where stuff isn't as up to date, how often stuff gets refreshed, right? You can see the cadence on how often all of our kind of major ingestion sources get refreshed, known limitations about, some things will only go back to 1970 or some things only go back to 2003 as the metadata has changed from the original sources, things like that. And then we completely tell you how all these computed metrics are built, exactly the formulas and stuff like that. So yeah, that's kind of the way it currently works right now. The way I use it. Oh, the other thing I want to show is like, if you don't know where to start, a common thing people want to know is like, who represents me, right? So you can go to your map view and be like, okay, like I live in, for me, I live in Virginia, right? Tim Kaine and Mark Warner are senators. You can see the midterms, the massive midterms are coming up in November. So there's like a ticker at the top that shows you how much time is between them. This is going to be a massive voting event because you're voting for senators and House of Representative members that could strongly swing controlling Congress, right? Because of the polarization in the US, who controls Congress is a big deal, right? And obviously with the gerrymandering and all the stuff going on across blue and red states right now, this has a massive impact on this. So a couple gaps here. Obviously, we don't have election information here yet. We don't have Supreme Court rulings, which obviously a big one happened recently with the Voting Rights Act. So there's a lot of stuff missing here, where the goal is to continually evolve what metadata is available and what type of information is available so that people can really tell the full story of like, why did something happen? What are you interested in? And really tell the story of something with the nuance it deserves. Because the downside of like social media and like microwave content is that they tell you an opinion like everything is fucked, right? And like is everything fucked? Like you don't know, right?
I don't think of microwave content. I don't think I've heard that one before.
Yeah, just like hot content where you just say some buzz shit and you don't have the nuance, right? A lot of these contexts, like if you especially look about foreign affairs, like the Israel-Palestine conflict and all these type of things, like they're very nuanced situations that get really dicey real quickly, especially when protected groups are involved and all these type of things, right? So like the goal is to remove the toxicity and the apprehension. Also, the thing is like people don't want to ask questions because they get scared about like what it means for them and like how people will take it and stuff like that when people have like genuine questions.
Yeah, so, even the question of what's happening based on who you're talking to, you're going to get a different response to that and interpretation of like what the conversation can actually gear towards. So this is that neutral approach. I think one thing I want to say, as someone who is always extremely weak in history classes, in AP Gov, in like all those types of like coursework, like I think this, for someone like myself, what this does is it ties information gathering, all the stuff that you do in data science, making it easier to access. So like we're talking about that Uber example, making information UI friendly, easy to access. But then what I also see this tying into, everyone has always had this conversation of why can't I just vote on my phone? Like we're in 2026, why can't I just like go on my phone and make decisions? Obviously we're not there yet. And I'm not the biggest proponent of digital identification, but what I do think that this gets closer to is getting everyone more informed that they can be more involved in government. Right now, obviously, you have all this information at the federal level and are going to work towards the state level. But I think once you work and cascade down from federal to state to local, what allows the average American to do is properly inform themselves, not just on, as you said, microwave content, but actually what the representatives are doing within the government. And for me, whenever I try to concern myself with what's happening within the socio-political world, I'm always trying to bring it back to, okay, yeah, it's like, 1, like super depressing. 2, overwhelming. 3, polarizing. What I always try to do is bring it back to like, okay, what can I actually do? And I think we're in a state in the world where you want to do everything, and you're seeing everything, but you're limited in what you can actually do, no matter how much information has become accessible. So this allows and will continue to allow people to try to get that information so they can tie it back into what they can actually do on a day, in their personal life.
I also think because of social media, everybody has a voice, right? And I think people want to use their voice more intelligently or like from a more educated place, right? Where like I want to have an opinion on what's happening. My intuition is that this is wrong, right? But like, how do you actually like come up with like clear arguments for and against why you think what you think? And I think it's an important like critical analysis tool in a world where influencer and like you said, like personality culture is a lot more what drives kind of movement in this way than real understanding of what's happening. And so presenting it in this way hopefully allows you to come up, like we want people to coming up with their own opinions, right? On how they deal with these things, and it's coming from a basis of facts that are not editorialized, right? And so like again, the goal is to build arguments, right? Normally, when you the logical flow, if you disagree on somebody on a policy or something with somebody, is to kind of go back all the way to the point where the initial foundational disagreement happens, and then you figure that out. Well, the only way you can do that is if you have a set of facts that you both agree upon, right? If you want to argue like LeBron is better than Michael Jordan or like one of the
You
opposite or
need the
whatever,
stats.
right? Well, yeah, you need like a base of like, okay, we agree that championships are important. We agree that certain these things happen. Here's the disconnect. I think that the fact he's been to a lot of championships is not a good thing. The fact he's lost a lot of them matters, when the other person's like, the fact he even went is a big accomplishment, right? So like that's the goal, is like this helps you easier distill like, okay, this is like kind of not negotiable. This opinion on what you do about it or how you deal with it, that is where the discussion should be centered around, right? That's where like ideological differences matter, right? Conservative tax policy is fundamentally different than liberal tax policy, and they come from different perspectives. That should be the argument, not like whether the deficit went up or whether or not people voted this way, right? That is it's a fact. And so the goal is to center arguments around something that's actually fruitful, not just this my facts are better than your facts thing.
Yeah, 100% agreed. Is there anything else you want to show here before we close the share? And then I have a one kind of final question for you before we close out.
Yeah, nothing really. Just like these kind of like other tying pieces, like the who's funding who. Obviously, it's a massive thing people care about. Is coming soon, and then the goal for the pull the thread page is that we're gonna actually give you a lot more flexibility to actually ask complex questions to the graph, and it's able to actually reason about it in some of these ways that we talked about previously. That will allow you to get more like concentrated, unique, kind of custom answers to specific questions you have, and that's kind of where the tool is headed. But that's pretty much it.
I think you can. I think it's yeah. There you go.
Yeah.
I mean, no, it's super exciting, and I think it's an extremely needed tool right now. So I mean, I'm hopeful that anyone that does listen to this ends up poking around. It's been super educational for just myself. I again am not the most informed on politics or government, and don't find time to keep up, but this has been a really interesting way to be able to like inform myself with facts and like just get an understanding of like what's happening in the first place. Okay, so we talked about a lot of things, and I think the way that I want to kind of close it up, I think both of us are still, even with how overwhelming the world is, even with how much is going on, even with how much time we spend looking at screens, I think both of us are relatively optimistic in like what is possible today, which wasn't possible a couple years ago. But I do want to ground it in reality. Like I made a reel yesterday where I was telling people like I feel burnt out, and like I'm looking at screens 24/7. And though it's funny, like we said back then, 10 years down the line, big boss says y'all better be doing something. And and I think both of us have advanced a lot in all the different aspects of our careers, our personal lives, whatever that might be. But again, it's overwhelming, and I think it's really easy to feel burnt out in the combination of everything that's happening within the technology world, everything that's happening in the geopolitical world, everything that's happening just on a day-to-day basis. I think everyone is in this mode of information overload, and it is exhausting. But another thing that you said back then was, don't think that because something hasn't happened for you yet, it won't happen. So with all the things that are going on, how do you kind of balance it all? How do you feel, as your kind of occupation has evolved, as your kind of mindset has evolved, as the world has evolved? And would you say that when you define success today, is it the same goal of you want to be a GM of a sports team? Or is there something else that you have in mind as how you define success as you continue in all your endeavors?
Yeah, I definitely think that it's changed a lot. I think a lot of my feelings about success were, extremely like career driven, and I still feel that way. Like working is a big part of my life. Like working on these projects, even if it's for fun, is a big part of what I do. But I think that I do think that the world is getting, because of social media, the algorithm proliferation, rage baiting, all these type of things. Like I think the world is definitely becoming more chaotic and more degenerate in certain ways, and I think that you know, it's you can lose yourself really quickly. And so I think like a lot of my goals now are a lot more grounded in like having time to like travel and like be with my family. Obviously, me and my girlfriend, we live together and like we do a lot of stuff together and like continuing to do stuff that has nothing to do with AI, that has nothing to do with any of these things like going to games, like having fun, traveling the world. I think a lot more of my goals are like towards like trying to find balance in that, where I care a lot less about like day job success and I care a lot more about like, okay, like am I making enough of an impact where I feel like I'm doing something good? Like this is why I'm starting a project like this, because like it's something that I care about, and I think the impact can be large for a large amount of people that are our age, particularly that are feeling a lot of these feelings of being overwhelmed. But it's a lot more about like balance, trying to get off the computer as much as possible. I think I don't do a good job of this right now, to be honest. Where I'm on the computer a lot because of like the anxiety also comes when all these new tools are coming out. You feel like if you're not building, you're behind, right? And so like every money I'm not spending prompting, like somebody else is prompting and being better, but like it's really not about that. So I think like the more and more technology advances, the more and more I feel like I shouldn't be on the internet. And I think that that has changed that specifically has changed a lot of my goals towards like I kind of want to like have enough money to like be able to travel, do the things I want to do, but like after that, being the highest on the totem pole is less of a major kind of catalyst for me. It's about impact in a way that I think is tangible, and spending time doing fun stuff that's not related to any of this. That I have a lot of hopes for. Like we're going to Houston for my girlfriend's birthday is 28th of May, so we're going to Houston in a couple of weeks. Like it's gonna be a lot of fun. I'm not gonna bring my computer, and I'm not gonna be actively on it, and I think it's important, right? And so things like that, I think, are a lot more part of my north star now than they were before. Even though I'm not really close at all in that respect. But yeah, those are things that I care a lot more about than the GM thing was a very like selfish thing. Like it was like, all right, I want to be the guy running a team, right? Like, and I just don't think like that as much anymore.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's crazy because the this is the third conversation I've had back, and I feel like in every conversation I've had, like that is the recurring theme for everyone as they get older, and I think the internet will have you feel a different way. That everyone is like so enthralled in this hustle culture, and everything we spoke to is probably more in that vein of like AI this, like adopt this, like
Yeah,
quickly do this, like get this thing done, like this is happening in the world, and it's like this like constant like stimulation. But on the other side of it, I think people are also coming to realize that it's really easy to get lost in it and just kind of forget like what your north star even is. And I've had this conversation at home a couple of times where metacognition has become so much more important, so the thinking about thinking, because it's so easy to, as we were saying earlier, like get lost in the algorithm, like have your attention stolen, like be on a screen, like just constantly being berated by random things that you may not be intentionally planning to spend your time on, but then do it anyways. So I think that like metacognition practicing has become so much more important. Like I've been trying to do it more myself, but like again, it's just so easy to feel like you're behind or not doing enough, and like go back into that mode of just like doing more.
I also think like the important thing too is like understanding like I recognize more that social media behavior. And this is the easiest example, that's why I keep using it. Is like when you think about like with the metacognition stuff you talk, you realize like some behaviors are toxic that you didn't fully realize it was. Like the way you consume content, it's not it's like a passive, it's like passively killing you, right? Versus like actively like doing something. Whereas like the way you consume content, like the feelings that it makes you feel when you see somebody being successful, that's like on their story, like doing something cool, like sometimes that makes you feel ways that like are not like you have to reflect on why do I feel this way, right? And I think that like those type of things are not, if you don't think about it, you don't really realize like, oh, like when somebody posts like their when I'm doing homework and somebody else is posting them, in Dubai, like it makes me feel a way. Like, well, like why? Why does it make you feel a way, right? And then you really start realizing, okay, like some of these things have completely warped what I think is success, what I think being a good person is, which I think is like a massive part of this. is like what morals look like in today's culture is vastly different from what morals look like pre pre this like proliferation of like everybody has a voice, everybody can say anything, right? And I think that that has really like helped me reevaluate like who I want to be and how I want to engage with this type of content. Like I think that the one thing I'm very grateful for, I think I was telling you that this the other day, like so we were born in '96, right? Like I think I still have very vivid memories of pre-internet time,
Yeah,
right?
same.
And but particularly obviously particularly when I was a kid, right? And like I have very fond feelings about the fact that I wasn't on an iPad when I was a kid. We were outside playing with football, running around, doing stuff, right? And I think that like that was really valuable for me and like a foundation that I didn't appreciate for like why I am the way that I am. And I think, some of these things that if you get too lost in the sauce, like you start losing yourself and it gets dangerous.
Yeah, yeah, no, 100%. It is a crazy time. Uh, yeah, and I watched a video recently talking to like Aristotle's like hedonia versus eudaimonia, and like I was like really I loved this video, and it was the first time I saw the word eudaimonia outside of that one phenomenology course that I always talk about.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like this stimulation and like hedonistic approach to life versus this like passion, fulfillment, purpose, connected feeling of life.
Yeah.
And like I feel the more you don't practice metacognition, the easier it is for you to fall into this recurring trap of just doing things passively. And
Yeah.
like you're saying, like it kills you passively. Like I think with social, more often than not, the two I think most recurring emotions on social are envy or guilt, where you're
Yeah.
either envious of a person doing something or guilty because you're not doing something. It's
Yep.
usually not neutral, and like
It's rarely positive.
it's rarely positive. Yeah. So
Yeah.
I think connecting with people is the most important thing to do now, and to remember that like we're not as different as we think we are across people. It's just we're unwilling to have conversation in
Yeah.
a way that we used to. Um, but all
Mm-hmm.
that makes sense, and I think striking balance has become so much harder, and it's that much more important to try to find that balance.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll wrap it up there. I'm wondering if there's anything else that you kind of want to share. I will definitely make sure that folks get a hold of your Substack and get to sign up to Shrink Theory to see kind of what's going on and the evolution of it. But wondering if there's anything else you want to share before we kind of sign off here.
Yeah, no, that's really it. I mean, I think if anybody's interested in any of these topics around building stuff in within this new age of agentic tools, or if you're interested in like the state of politics in the U.S. right now and like how not fun it is for almost everybody, regardless of kind of where your leanings are. Definitely follow on Substack. Can hit me up there. Definitely would like to engage with people more about like kind of how they feel about all these different things, the anxiety around it. And yeah, I would just say like make sure you go outside.
I've been putting that on my story randomly more often. It's just a tree, and I just say go outside.
Yeah,
Going
you gotta
outside
go
is
outside.
important. Go outside, touch some grass.
Yeah,
All right. Well, thank you for being on. This is a longer than the last two podcasts, but like we talked about a lot of stuff, which is super fun. Which is I didn't expect to talk about this many things because we talk every day, so I
yeah,
wasn't sure how it would go. But like
yeah,
this is a really fun conversation, and I hope to have you back soon. And it's not again. Yeah, like I've told everyone this so far. It's not like a 10-year gap between this and the next one we do.
yeah.
So thank you for signing on. Anyone that listened all the way through, let me know if you have any questions on how to like get a hold of any of the things that we talked about, or have any like AI related questions or any outside questions or whatever it might be. But thank you for listening, and catch y'all soon. Peace.